On Oregon's Others, a historical study that explores how immigrant communities in Oregon experienced surveillance, discrimination, and pressure during the early 20th century, especially around World War I. This book highlights how German, Japanese, and other immigrant groups were labeled as enemy aliens and were constantly monitored and judged based on their perceived loyalty to the United States. Rather than focusing on oppression, Oregon's Others shows how these communities responded by documenting their lives, building connections, and telling their own stories in order to resist being erased or misrepresented. To understand this story, we need to define intersectionality. Intersectionality is the idea that different parts of a person's identity, like race, gender, class, religion, and nationality, overlap and shape how they experience oppression. For immigrants in Oregon, this meant they were they were not targeted for just one reason. For example, being both an immigrant and a woman, or being Japanese and working class, created layered forms of discrimination. During World War I, laws like the Espionage Act and Sedition Act made this worse by allowing the government to monitor and control immigrant communities more closely. So, intersectionality helps us understand that these experiences were not simple, they were complex and deeply connected. The top three tools for disrupting intersectionality in Oregon's Others are documentation and photography, organizing, gathering, and networking, and strategic storytelling and counter narratives. One key way immigrants resisted oppression was through documentation and photography. They created their own records, photos, letters, and diaries that captured their lived experiences. For example, some immigrants were required to take registration photos as enemy aliens, but even though this was a government requirement, these images became something more, personal records of identity and existence. By documenting themselves, they challenged the state's version of who they were and preserved their own stories for the future. Another important tool was community organizing and networking. Immigrants built strong support systems through churches, social groups, and businesses like laundries and hotels. These spaces allowed people to share information, support each other, and maintain their cultural identities. This was powerful because it disrupted the isolation that surveillance systems tried to create. The third tool was storytelling and creating counter narratives. Immigrant women, especially Japanese Issei women, used storytelling through letters and conversations to define themselves on their own terms. This challenged stereotypes and allowed communities to preserve their histories rather than letting the government define them. Storytelling became a way to reclaim voice, identity, and power. As we conclude, these images remind us that the stories of Oregon's Others are not just historical, they offer lessons about resistance, belonging, and the ongoing work of challenging intersectional inequity. First, these images show that communication itself was a tool of resistance. Immigrant communities documented their lives, took photographs, organized gatherings, and told their own stories. These weren't passive acts, they were deliberate strategies to assert identity and preserve memory. Second, the images remind us that Oregon's immigrant communities were not simply acted on, they built institutions, maintained cultural practices, and protected their histories even when the state tried to exclude or erase them. Third, the wartime materials like registration forms and loyalty cards show how surveillance and compliance worked together to define who counted as American. These systems weren't neutral, they shaped belonging and exclusion. Finally, the book pushes us to think about how these same mechanisms show up today. When we understand the historical tools used to police identity and belonging, we are better equipped to recognize and challenge similar patterns in our own time. Thank you.